Chapter 10. It was only a few hours past sunrise, and already the sun was blazing. Sweat dripped from every part of his body, and his pants clung to him. Arbol stood, stretched his back, and wiped at his brow with the backs of his hands, but more sweat soon beaded on his forehead. It fell into his eyes and made them sting. It only served to remind him of the tears he spilled the night before. He had been so sure that this morning he would be working as a house slave instead of toiling in the fields with the other slaves. And yet here he was, his heart full of disappointment. A long shadow fell on him as he bent over and tied the bundles of chopped sugarcane together. Arbol looked up and saw Senor Perez on his horse. There was a nasty grin on the overseer's face.
Didn't pick you, did they? Thought you could escape working in the fields?
Arbol felt the heat of embarrassment prickle up his neck and onto his face. But he did not reply. He turned his attention back to the bundles of cane.
I told you there was no room in that pretty house for you. You don't belong there. A dirty, ugly African like you belongs in the fields. Don't know what you thought you were aspiring to.
Arbol stopped what he was doing and stood with his back erect. He looked up at Perez. There were so many things he wanted to say, so many things he imagined doing, one of which was wrapping his very own whip around the man's neck. Arbol's rage rose as the overseer wrung more pleasure from emasculating him in front of the others.
¿Qué pasa, Arbolito? Or perhaps we should start calling you Arbolita.
Someday I will be in that saddle and prove that I'm a better man than you.
Arbol gulped when he realized what he had said. He saw the whip at the overseer's side and the pistol at the other, ever at the ready. He'd seen what had happened to other slaves when they reacted without thinking, when coaxed into a brawl. It was bad enough when they refused to cater to the white man's whim. Perez sat, stunned, mouth agape. He shook his head and sputtered.
You what?
Perez grabbed at the whip, unfurled it, then flung his arm back. Arbol flinched.
Oye, pero qué pasa aquí? What's going on here?
Arbol was pleased to see a startled Perez turn to Alonso and have to rein in his anger and indignation. The other slaves immediately turned back to their work and lapsed into ignoring what was happening around them.
Don Alonso, this son of a whore was trying to...
Trying to?
Alonso dismounted and waited. Then he twirled his hand in the air as if trying to pull the words from Perez, who was still sitting atop his horse, a blank look on his face.
Looked to me like you were taunting this man.
What? How can you say that? This insolent slave was trying to provoke me. He was...
Basta ya! No need to lie. I'll be speaking to my father about this. He has a strict policy against mistreating our slaves, or baiting them. Now, if you will excuse me.
Alonso went back to his horse, picked up the reins, and patted the animal. He handed the reins to Perez. The overseer took them grudgingly. Alonso rolled up his sleeves.
I'm learning all there is to know about Casa Rodrigo. Take my horse back to the stable. Promptly! No animal should be out here in this heat.
But...
That will be all, Perez. Thank you.
The sun was directly in Alonso's face, but he made sure not to hold his hand up to block the sun, as he might have done otherwise. He needed to maintain eye contact with the overseer. After a moment, Perez rode away, muttering angrily while pulling the other horse behind him. Alonso turned and looked at Arbol, who grinned from ear to ear. Alonso was unable to resist grinning back. The joy on Arbol's face was infectious.
Gracias, señor.
For what?
For defending me.
For a moment, neither of them spoke. Behind them, other slaves were catching up. Alonso looked into Arbol's face and did his best not to gaze at the broad shoulders, the sculpted massive chest, and areola the size of gold coins. He tried not to notice Arbol's biceps or the taut, ribbed stomach.
Señor, is the heat too strong for you?
What? Nonsense.
Alonso snapped back into the present. Arbol looked at him with a furrowed brow. A line of slaves stopped, clearly hesitant to ask him and Arbol to move. Alonso licked his lips and forced himself to focus. He stepped out of the way, pulling Arbol with him.
I believe you were tying these bundles together when I showed up. Why?
They're easier to carry to the wagons, señor.
But then you have to walk to the wagons, walk back, and someone has to untie these bundles once they get to where they're going. Isn't that right?
I believe so, but I only work in the field. I have never been in the distillery. I don't even know how they get the sugar out.
How would it be if we had wagons moving alongside? That way, you wouldn't need to tie the cane. You could just toss it up once you chopped it down.
But, senor, less cane would then have to be planted to make room for the wagons.
Yes, I see your point. Father will not be pleased to lose money by planting less sugarcane, but I'll have to show him how much more efficient it is, especially if we had another crop. And if I can persuade him to make our own brand of rum and molasses from the unused portion of the sugarcane, the possibilities could be endless.
Alonso was excited to discuss his ideas with his father, but he would wait until he'd had time to see the entire operation before making any suggestions on improving efficiency, profit, and conditions at Casa Rodrigo. Alonso wormed his way back into the ordered lines of slaves with Arbol beside him. Within minutes, he was working among them as if he had been doing the work all along. It wasn't long before Alonso began to sweat profusely. He took off his shirt, aware Arbol was watching. The other slaves watched as well, even if they pretended not to. Purposely, Alonso mopped at his body with the soft cotton shirt, then wrapped the sleeves around his head like a Moor. When they reached the end of the line, and the bundles had all been neatly tied, Arbol stopped.
You should leave now. It's time to haul the bundles of cane onto the wagons. And they're very heavy.
No. If you can do this, so can I. I'm seeing this through to the end.
Without a word, Arbol bent down and slung one of the bundles onto his shoulder almost effortlessly. Alonso tried to do the same, except his knees buckled and his legs wobbled. He wasn't accustomed to this type of heavy labor and nearly lost his balance. But the other slaves were watching. Alonso knew he could not fail. He thought of Arbol, of the two of them together, and somehow it gave him strength. Alonso tossed the bundle onto the wagon while the slaves around him clapped and grinned appreciatively. Strangely, he felt empowered. Tossing Arbol a quick glance before picking up his second bundle, Alonso saw the grin on his face, the look in his eyes, and knew Arbol would be his.